Greetings and salutations, and welcome to JC's Top 5 Linux Myths. I hope this video finds you doing well wherever you are in the world. When I announced that I was going to be doing a video like this on the community section of my channel, some people jumped up in the comments and said, well, you don't need to do this. This has been really well covered. I went and looked. I don't have a video on my channel about myths. I know that a lot of other people have done that. But even though it may have been covered a lot, it might not hurt to do it again, simply because I keep hearing these things over and over again. They pop up in forums I read, they pop up in comments on my own videos, and people ask me questions directly about these things. So let's go over them one more time. Plus, I might have a slightly different spin on things than you're used to, like what you hear from other people in the community. So you'll just have to watch the video and find out about that and see whether that's true or not. You ranked the myths. Thank you so much to everybody who partook in the poll that I placed in the community comments section on my channel. I have no idea what you really voted for. I just put a list in there and said vote. So some people may have voted because they thought one myth was more important than another, or others may have voted because they wanted to hear me talk about one myth more than the other. I have no idea. I froze the results as of Saturday, September the 12th, 2020, to put together the graphics for this video. So the results may look a little bit different than what you see in the video itself because the poll is still up. So, before we get into the myths themselves, I think it's important that I take just a minute here and explain who I am and where my answers to these questions come from. I have run a project called Easy Linux for about the last 5 years, and it's a community outreach thing where I have helped people get started with Linux all around the world. And I've talked to thousands and thousands of people through YouTube, through all kinds of different places. And these are things that keep popping up, and I have developed some pretty standard answers to help people understand not only that these myths are false, but navigate their way around any pitfalls that might come depending on what they're talking about. Most myths have a grain of truth. There's a reason why it got started that way. And sometimes it's a matter of approaching something the right way to avoid those pitfalls. So we'll talk about that as we roll along. I've been a Linux user for about 15 years now. The first time I saw Linux was way back in 1999. I was working at Gateway Computer in Hampton, Virginia. They had a computer in the lab there that was running Open Caldera. So that's been a long time ago. And I was really fascinated with Linux because they told me at the time that Linux was a free and open Unix-like operating system. So if you had used Unix in the past, then Linux would be familiar to you. And I had used Unix in the past. One of the first real jobs I had was working for a radio station that had a Unix mini-frame system. And there were terminals all over the building, and we all had accounts, and we used it for numerous things. And I was fascinated by that. And even to this day, Linux strikes me as being cool, like that original Unix mini-frame system did way back in the late 80s. Now I'm dating myself. So let's get into the myths. Number 5. Linux is hard to install. Now, those of you who have been around Linux for a long time might think to yourself, gee, why would anybody ever think that? Well, people who are outside of the community, they've gotten a lot of information to lead them to believe that Linux is going to be really difficult to get going, and it keeps them away from doing it. They're afraid of getting into Linux. So my answer to that is that myth is false as long as you keep it simple. I think that's the main thing. If you're not a supercomputer nerd, if you're not somebody who is really into the hardware side of things, then your best bet is to get yourself a computer, get yourself a little laptop. You can find them on eBay. They're relatively cheap. Look for corporate leases that have been dumped back on the market and refurbished. You can get a machine that 2 or 3 years ago sold for $1,500, $2,000, you can get that same machine for $150 to $300, depending on how good it is. Get you one of those machines. It's the best way to go. You don't necessarily want the latest and greatest brand new hardware because you might run into some issues with that. Sometimes Linux is a little bit behind when you're talking about brand new hardware. It really is comfortable on slightly older machines, easy to install, easy to set up, and you won't have to do a whole lot of tinkering to get things running. Don't dual boot. People get in trouble with dual boots. Linux gets blamed for borking a lot of computers a lot of the time, not because Linux did anything wrong, but because somebody set up a dual boot which they did not know how to maintain, and something broke, and then they couldn't fix it, and they had to go out and get this computer reloaded, and then they go around telling people that Linux broke their computer. Every time that I say something about don't dual boot in a video, somebody jumps up in the comments and says, "He's crazy. I don't know what he's talking about. I've dual booted for years. It's super easy. I never have a problem with it." When you see those sorts of comments, I want you to keep this in mind. That person is the kind of person who thought algebra class was fun. That is somebody who understands the system really well. They know how a bootloader works. They know how hard drives work. They know how partitions work. They understand the boot process. So therefore, if anything goes crazy, they can fix it real easy. And they've known how to do that for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like not to know. Keep that in mind. The regular scenario that I put forward first off is really usually what happens. People find a tutorial, they get Linux running, they think they're going to be able to have their cake and eat it too, and I get to keep my Windows and I get to play with Linux at the same time. Something breaks and then it gets really bad. So when people ask me about dual boots, regardless of how you do it, I don't care if you're installing Linux on a USB drive that you're going to plug in, or you have two separate hard drives in the machine, or you're going to use different partitions on a single drive. It makes no difference to me. I always say the same thing. I do not recommend, nor do I support dual boots. So if you decide to dual boot your system, you're on your own. You have been warned. Now, before you get into installing Linux on your hardware, do a little research. It goes a really long way to making it easy for you to get started. So find a machine that you want. You don't even have to buy it first. Let's say that you see a nifty-looking Dell Studio or an HP EliteBook. You can go to Google or the search engine of your choice, and you can put in install distribution, whatever that might be. Let's say you want to start with Linux Mint. So install Linux Mint on make and model of computer. You're going to get a lot of feedback from people who have done exactly the same thing that you want to do. And if you see people having a lot of problems, you might want to consider looking for another machine. With most hardware these days, anything that's been produced in the last 10 years, Linux runs out of the box. You may have to install a driver for your Wi-Fi or your video card. You plug the machine in to an Ethernet source for internet, install it, then install your drivers for your Wi-Fi, and you get that up and running. That might happen, but it's going to work. Now, you may win the lottery, though. You might end up with some machine that's in that 10% that has some component in there that's not supporting Linux well. The company never thought about Linux, or they didn't make it for Linux, or they have no Linux support and it just doesn't work. And in that case, sometimes you can tinker and get that to run, but usually it's best just to walk away and get yourself a machine that works well with Linux, especially if you are not supercomputer savvy. All right? Now, installing Linux is something that is getting less and less of a thing, because nowadays a lot of computer companies sell machines with Linux pre-installed. System 76 and Dell have been doing it for years. Well, so is HP these days, and Lenovo is coming on board with ThinkPads that are going to come with Red Hat Linux or Ubuntu on them. That's happening right now. So the days of Linux being that system that in order to use you have to install yourself are going bye-bye. Most people that got started with computers running Windows They didn't have to install it. They bought it and it was already there. Well, that's getting to be the case with Linux too, so that's pretty cool. Number 4, Linux isn't secure. False. I should have said totally, absolutely, completely false on this one. And I know that when people who are familiar with Linux see this, they always giggle because it is the exact opposite. Linux is by far the safest operating system that you can run on your desktop or laptop computer at home, which is behind a firewall. The chances of you getting some kind of hack or infection on that computer are very, very small. It's not completely out of the question. It's not like it's impossible. There's no such thing as perfection. But the chances of you getting a virus on your Linux desktop computer at home are about as good as you being hit by a meteorite sitting in the chair where you are right now. No, you do not need antivirus for Linux. Really. You don't want it. You don't need it. Don't worry about it. I know that there are people online that push antivirus, but they don't really have the experience using Linux in a standard office or home environment, and they're just going off assumptions. They're tinfoil hat people. Linux doesn't need antivirus, and the antivirus that is available for Linux is mainly there to look for Windows viruses that may come into your computer and you might accidentally pass on to another Windows computer. If you're not going to worry about that, you don't need it. You don't need to have the extra headroom. You don't need to slow the machine down. Don't worry about it. Linux is inherently built for security, just like Unix was. Linux is a Unix work-alike. So Unix was originally built to work on huge computer systems that would have hundreds of people logged in on terminals anywhere in the world that were hooked up to that machine. So security was really top priority, and it's the same way with Linux. That's what makes it secure. There's a myth within a myth here, and that is some people will say, well, Linux is secure because nobody uses it. That doesn't hold water at all, and here's why. The internet runs on Linux, at least 3/4 of it. Most embedded devices run on Linux. Supercomputers run on Linux. Your smart TV runs on Linux. If you have an Android phone, that's Linux. If you have a Chromebook, that's Linux. All of these devices and big, huge websites like Facebook and Google, they don't announce every day that they've been hacked. And that's because they're running on Linux. So Linux is inherently secure. I have a server that runs facing the public internet to serve out my web page that's been up and running for 2.5, 3 years now. And it has never, ever had anything close to a breach. Every time that I log into that server to do maintenance or see what's going on, the operating system, which is CentOS, tells me how many unsuccessful attempts at logging into that system happened while I was away. And it can be anywhere from 1 to 20, depending on how people want to bang on it. That's happening all the time on anything that faces the internet. I have no worries whatsoever about anybody getting into that server. Now, you don't need antivirus, but one thing you do need to do with Linux is install your updates when they come in. You have to do that. That's how Linux stays secure. There was an article that was published some time ago that said basically that Linux was the most insecure system because there were more vulnerabilities reported for Linux than any of the others. That came from somebody who obviously didn't understand how the Linux community works. You see, people are out there looking for these vulnerabilities all the time. And when they're reported, they are patched. So in the process of looking for these vulnerabilities, you could very easily construe that as being that Linux is somehow super vulnerable. It's not. Every time one of those theoretic vulnerabilities was discovered, that's something that somebody might exploit. Not that they actually did it, it was fixed. And usually by the time you hear about it, it's already fixed. Over the years, there have been some big things that have come along, like Heartbleed and Dirty Cow, which were these big vulnerabilities supposedly found in Linux. And when the story hit, At the very end of the story, they'd usually say, but the patches went out to fix it 3 days ago, and if you just update your system, you're okay. Okay? It got to be anticlimactic. We don't even hear that anymore because of that. So that's why Linux is secure, and you need to install those updates to keep yourself secure. When you're dealing with Windows, you're usually hesitant to install updates because it might break something. Now, updates in Linux, the same thing can happen, but it's really, really very rare that it does. The benefit of keeping yourself up to date and secure far outweighs the possibility that something might break. And with stuff like TimeShift, which is a program that you can use to roll back your Linux installation, it's really not worth worrying about. So, to keep yourself secure in Linux, install your updates, and use common sense practices like don't click on things you don't know what they are, and don't go to websites you know are sketchy. Do those sorts of things, you'll never have a problem with it. Okay, let's move on to the next myth. Number 3, Linux doesn't have good support. False. I have heard more than once from people who are looking at Linux for business the same phrase, and that is, Linux is the wild, wild west, and you're not going to be able to use it because if you have a problem, you're not going to be able to fix it, and da-da-da-da. It's not true. Each distribution of Linux has forums and wikis that you can become a part of. You can log into these things and get real-world information from people who are trying to do exactly the same things that you're doing. Thousands of people around the world are willing to help you. Some of them will do that for pay, and other people just do it because they love Linux and they're part of the community. Like, I have helped countless people and never asked for any sort of compensation because, A, it's usually just a matter of pointing them in the right direction and going, here's your information. Because if you're new to Linux, it can be hard to find information on what you need just simply because you don't know what to look for. You know what the problem is, but you're not sure how to search. So sometimes explaining it to somebody, they can just hook you up with the right stuff and then you learn from there on, right? Nothing wrong with that. Now, one of the things that you have to keep in mind if you are asking for help in a forum or reaching out to somebody in the community is that attitude is everything. Linux is not a product. You didn't pay for it. Everybody's really used to blasting Apple and Microsoft and talking about how crappy the software is and how the support is horrible, and you get used to that. And it's like everybody kind of goes into it with this kind of snarky attitude. You do that in a Linux forum and you're not going to make any friends and you're not going to get a lot of help. Be careful about venting frustration. Don't say things like, Linux sucks and this is a piece of garbage and I can't get it working, because that's going to put people off. Remember, you're talking to a community. You're not talking to people working for a company, and there's a difference. And a lot of people are doing that as a labor of love. So just be kind and do your research first. You try and find an answer before you ask, because people do tend to get frustrated in forums and chats when somebody comes along and asks a really simple question that they know for sure they could have found a really easy answer to. So before you reach out, make sure that you've got yourself together, okay? And you'll be surprised. People will bend over backwards to help you. People have done that with me over the years, and it's always been quite humbling. The developers of the software and the operating system itself are unbelievably responsive if you are very forthcoming about what you want, and you do that in a kind way. You say, oh, I could really use this feature or whatever. It's amazing to me. Sometimes I have posted videos asking questions about things, and I have had the developer of the piece of software that I was asking about contact me and go, what are you trying to do? And I tell them, and then the next thing you know is they contact me again and they go, okay, update that because I fixed it. It's happened to me. It's amazing. This isn't like some big corporation that you can't talk to. These are real people around the world who contribute to Linux. So if you have that attitude, the support is absolutely wonderful. Now, sometimes you'll run across a bug, and that's it. If it's a bug, you got to wait until they fix it. You got to work around the bug. That's all there is to it. That happens with every operating system. Linux tends to be developed very quickly, though, and usually a workaround comes along or the fix to the bug pretty quick. So keep that in mind. I would rather try and troubleshoot a Linux system than work on anything else proprietary, because with proprietary systems you get to a point where either they don't know what they're talking about or it falls under the category of we can't tell you about that because it's a secret. You know, when I was doing Windows IT for many, many years, I saw some pretty intelligent guys stand there and stare at a computer and go, I don't know what that thing's doing. And these were people that were really tuned in to what was going on in the Windows ecosystem. Linux ain't like that. Everybody knows what it's doing, and everybody can find out. So there's good support. You just have to learn how to get it and become part of that community. Number 2, Linux doesn't have good software. Now this part of the video might get me in trouble with some people, and that's because I say it's mostly false. It depends on. And what it depends on is your point of view. There are those who come to Linux and they want it to be an exact replacement for Windows. These are the same kind of people that walk into a computer shop, put their computer on the counter and says, I want you to fix this thing, but don't change anything about it at all. I just hand it back to them because I might have to change something to fix it. And the first thing that you need to understand if you're coming into Linux from a Windows reality or even a Mac reality is that Linux is not Windows, and that's what that little piece of code there between Linux and Windows means. That's code from the C programming language and Bash that basically is not equal to. So that's a little joke for you nerds in there. I thought you'd get a kick out of that. So people need to understand that Linux is going to be different, and you're not necessarily going to find a one-on-one replacement for the software that you're using every day, let's say in a Windows environment. And there are those out there that go, well, you know, I really can't get along without WordEater version 2.4. I've got to have that program. And you may be able to get that running with Wine in Linux, which is a program that you can install that allows you to run a lot of Windows-based programs on Linux. Works sometimes, sometimes it doesn't, depends on the program. That's another thing you have to do a lot of research about. But if you can get away from that, and if you can back up and you can say, wait a minute, there are thousands of native applications and tools available for Linux, totally free, all kinds of sources for software. Don't get yourself in trouble. Don't download software off the internet for Linux. Look in your local repositories first. Every distribution has a lovely piece of software in there that hooks you up with all the stuff that's in the repositories and snap packages, flat packs, whatever. Look there first because we know those things are going to work. Stuff that's available on the internet that you quote-unquote download for Linux, or especially if you have to compile the software to run, don't do that if you're just starting out. If you don't understand how that works, stick to what's in the repositories. Believe me, people who run Linux do everything that people who run Windows do. It's just you're going to have to look at a different way of doing it. That's why I say think workflow. Don't think program. Don't think I need an exact replacement for this. How would I get this accomplished? You might have to use 2 pieces of software and do some of it in one and some in the other, but you can make that happen. This is another really good reason to have a Linux machine that is separate from everything else. You can continue to do what you do the way you've been doing it while you're learning how to do it on another system. A lot of the times I find that once I get my head wrapped around what I'm trying to do, and if I go and do it on Linux, I usually find a simpler solution with a lot less extra stuff going on. And it's one of the reasons that I love to work with Linux. So once you get yourself together and you know what you're doing, you found what you need to get what you need to get done, make sure that you give back to the projects that benefit you. So every project out there has some way for you to donate, and Cold Hard Cash is a really good way to start. You can also report bugs on software that you use all the time. Learn how to do that. That's something that helps developers quite a bit. Let them know what you come across that isn't working so that they can be aware of that and fix that for future updates. It's very important to become involved, and then suggest features that you need, which is something that I already talked about with the last myth, because they kind of go together. You'd be amazed at how these people are, if you really just go to them and you're very sincere about it and very nice, what they will do to help you to make their software work for you. And of course, it's not listed here, but the truth of the matter is, if you don't like the software that you find in Linux, you can write your own if you want to take the time to learn how to do it. And it's not that hard. You can do some pretty complicated things with some pretty simple scripts that you can write in Bash. Hey, might not be something that you can do today, but down the road you could make that a goal. So let's talk about the number one reason. Well, wait a minute. Before we get into that, let me touch on this. One of the things that people say all the time is that Linux doesn't have good game support. That is false. Linux has wonderful game support. If you use something like Steam, there are thousands of games that you can play on Linux. It may not be the exact title that you're used to. You may have invested a lot of money and time into Windows games that you would like to continue to play. You know what? There's nothing wrong with that. Move all of the stuff that you can over to your Linux machine. If you want to keep playing your games on Windows, no problem. Just uninstall all the other garbage off that computer and make it a game console. Keep it separate. But while you're at it, make sure that you install Steam on your Linux machine and explore that, because that's awesome. My son plays games all the time on his Ubuntu machine. And I wanted to mention that. I almost forgot, even though I didn't put it in the thing. There are plenty of good games on Linux, but if you still want to play games on Windows, great. Turn your Windows machine into that's all it does. Game console. Done. Number one. Linux is just for nerds and computer science grads. This is totally, absolutely, 100% false. Anybody can use Linux. Anybody can get started with Linux. You just have to take some time to learn it. The first thing is that you need to understand here, if you're used to using Mac or you're used to using Windows, Linux is going to be different. It's a different system. It's not hard. It's actually simple. But you have to wrap your head around how the system works. It's a different computing philosophy. So you have to approach it that way. Modern distros are super easy. They're point and click. If you get Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Manjaro, any of the Ubuntu flavors, Linux Mint and Ubuntu Mate seem to me to be the easiest to start people out with, because they're very point and click, and you don't have to do a great deal of setup. You get pretty much an operating system that has everything included just by installing it. And there's these beautiful welcome screens that you just go click, 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 and you're ready to go. But pretty much any modern distro, they're easy to get started, and every one of them has documentation. Like Linux Mint has a wonderful installation guide. Ubuntu has its wiki with all the different flavors of Ubuntu. So read that before you decide on your distribution. Go check it out and get yourself armed with a little information. And then it's point and click and boom, 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 you're done. Give yourself some time to learn. That's really important. Some people get very frustrated with Linux because they try and move too quickly. They're trying to do too much with it at once. And once again, this is a reason to have a separate computer. Install the distro as it is. Learn how it works before you start modifying things. People get themselves in a lot of trouble because they're too excited, they want to get into it, and they want to really make this computer be what they want it to be, but they're not quite ready technically to do that, and they start poking at it and they end up breaking stuff and they have to backtrack, and oh, it gets crazy. There's not a Linux user on the planet that hasn't started out with Linux and broke it and had to reinstall it. We call it borking up the computer. And when you bork something up, there's no other way around it. You're just going to have to reinstall. It's part of the Linux experience. So give yourself time to do that. And you never stop learning with Linux, ever. Never. You just, it's something that nobody completely masters. Even the people who create the distributions. It's huge. There are so many commands, so many programs, so many things to learn that you never stop learning. And it's fast changing as well. So you might start out being a complete novice, but as you walk your way through the process, you're going to find yourself getting hip really quick. It doesn't take that long. And for the people who come along and say, well, if you want to use Linux, you have to use a terminal. You absolutely have to have that. You know, there's all of these spooky, cryptic commands you have to put in. Let me tell you what. You don't need to know how to work in a terminal. My mother, who is 79 years old, runs Linux. She very rarely opens up a terminal. But you know what? She actually knows her way around because she's a smart Linux user. Because I told her early on, I said, you really need to get yourself familiar with that. And she did. And she has enough information that if a fix comes along that she has to open a terminal to do, or she has to edit a file, she can do it. And that's what you need to do too. You don't need to be in that terminal all the time, but you need to take a little time to learn that, because usually when people tell you ways to fix your system, if you're getting support, they're going to tell you to open up a terminal and do A, B, and C, and that's how it's going to happen. And for all of those who say, well, the terminal is archaic and you really shouldn't have to do that, do you want to know what the #1 video on this channel is, and the one that gets the most views of any of the videos I've ever posted? We're talking in the millions now. Beginner's Guide to Using the Bash Terminal. And I know you Linux guys always come along and say, Bash isn't a terminal, it's a command line environment. I know that. The reason why I called the video that was so when people searched for it, it would pop up. If they put in terminal, they get it. If they put in Bash, they get it. If they could put, it's searchability. We know what Bash is, okay? So we don't need to correct the creator on that one. But that is the most watched video that I have on my channel. And it gets people started working in a terminal. Gives them all the basic commands that they need to get going. So there's a lot of interest in it out there, which is wonderful. Now, I've been doing this for 5 years, ladies and gentlemen. And we're getting ready to wrap up the video. And this video kind of represents bookends from the first video that I've done. What has changed since I started in a lot of ways. And Linux has gotten better and better and better, and the community has gotten better and better at helping people get started with Linux. And yes, we still have the same persistent myths and the problems, and it gets frustrating sometimes, but you know what? We're winning. You can now install Windows, and you can have Ubuntu running Bash in your Windows. And I know I posted videos about how skeptical I was of that, and I still am quite a bit, and I worry a little bit. But as I have watched that over time, it's brought people to Linux that weren't here before. So I remember at the end of that video saying, boy, I hope I'm wrong. I think maybe I was. So there you go. Top 5 Linux myths. Counting them down. We'll do it again soon. Thank you so much for watching. See ya.